Let's get started here. So, Estango and Chakaidega, SJ Laura Jacobs, Choho Jifkados, Muskogee Murayes. Good morning, friends and relatives. It's a good day to be Indigenous. My name is Laura Jacobs, and I'm a citizen of Muskogee Creek Nation and a PhD student at Oregon State. I'm chair of the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Club, which is hosting and facilitating this summit. And I'm very excited this morning to introduce the White House presentation and Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge public listening session. Today we have Gretchen Goldman, who is the Assistant Director for Environmental Science, Engineering, Policy, and Justice at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I think I got that right. And then we have Haley Scott as well, who is from the same office. And yeah, just take it away, Gretchen. And thank you all, Mado, so much for coming today. We're excited to get this started.
Great, thanks so much, Laura, and thank you all for being here, especially bright and early for anyone West Coast or further west. So first I want to acknowledge that we are calling in from Washington, D.C., which is the ancestral homeland of the Anacostan and Piscataway people. And I'm going to share my screen to do the presentation. I'm going to hide all the boxes. All right, I think that should work. No boxes. Okay. Yep. Okay. So we're going to get started and give a little presentation, and then we'll follow that with a listening session where we want to hear from you all as well. So first I want to start off with a note about terminology. As you likely know from attending this conference and previous experience, there's not one term that encapsulates the knowledge that's held by tribes, Indigenous people, and communities. There's actually several terms that are used in different contexts, and these terms are dependent on place, on context, on the person using the words, and this also terminology is often dependent on stories, and there's a lot of context where words really matter. And so for this presentation, you might hear us use different terms and such as Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, or abbreviations for those. And but we want to acknowledge that there's many terms and understandings and agreements exist, and this is a point of active discussion in terms of the terms that we'll use in the context of the White House effort that you're going to hear about today. So the Biden-Harris administration has made a commitment to strengthening relationships with tribal nations and Native communities. In the first week of the administration, the president issued a memorandum and wrote, "It is the priority of my administration to make respect for tribal sovereignty and self-governance, commitment to fulfilling federal trust and treaty responsibilities to tribal nations, and regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal nations, cornerstones of federal Indian policy." And so this memorandum and several other actions early on set into motion a lot of efforts under this administration to strengthen relationships in various ways. And so one of those has been a recommitment to Executive Order 13175, which is an executive order that applies to rules, policies, and guidance with tribal implications. In here, tribal implications is defined as anything that has a substantial direct effect on one or more Indian tribes, on the relationship between the federal government and Indian tribes, or on the distribution of power and responsibilities between the federal government and Indian tribes. And it also requires the federal government to consult with federally recognized tribal nations on policies that affect them. And so as part of this recommitment to this executive order, federal agencies are now required to prepare and periodically update a detailed plan of action to implement the policies and the directives of this executive order. And so the administration hosted in November 2021 the first of this administration's White House Tribal Nations Summit. And at that summit last November, there was a lot of discussion and announcements and other active points of deliberation on different policies. But one of the things that was announced at this event was this effort around traditional ecological knowledge. And so President Biden announced this at that event, and this effort was motivated by requests from tribal leaders for guidance from the federal government around TEK. All right, so Haley is going to talk momentarily about some of the details about what about the commitment and details of what we're doing from the White House perspective. But before we get into some of those details, I wanted to highlight a few examples of what we mean by thinking about Indigenous knowledge in federal decision making. And so we highlighted in the memo that's at the link below, and that Haley's going to talk about more momentarily, some examples of places where Indigenous knowledge intersected with federal government decision making. And so the first example that we highlight in that memo, it was from work that was initiated by the Cowlitz Indian tribe, working with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And this was a project that involved application of tribal oral histories and looking at the reconstruction of the distribution of the Yulikan, a fish, and they worked with elders from the tribe to recreate the tributaries and range and run times of the fish, and that helped inform NOAA's actions to protect the species and via the Endangered Species Act. And so it had a direct it was included directly in the federal policy decision around that. And so another example that we included there was around with the National Park Service, which works with several Wabanaki tribal citizens in Acadia National Park in Maine, and they work on shared governance and research around sweetgrass harvesting. And here, Wabanaki knowledge and the people who generate it are leading National Park Service research and management strategies in the park. We also talked about Papahana Makuakea Marine National Monument, which is in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. And this involves a co-management arrangement between the State of Hawaii Cultural Department and federal agencies on management of the monument. And it involves Hawaiian knowledge and management strategies leading the effort and helping to conserve the area and manage it. And then lastly, we also talk in the memo about another example in Alaska around the Northern Bering Sea climate resilience area. And this is a project where there are tribes, Alaska Native nonprofits, elders, and traditional knowledge holders who are working with the federal government through a tribal advisory council and other efforts where there is integration in the decision-making of approach, and this is a good example of how Indigenous values and knowledge can inform and shape decisions that the federal government is making in that area. And so before you can read more about those details in the memo at the link and the language that these are described in. We worked with the tribes and Indigenous people and agencies that were involved in that effort to make sure that we characterized it correctly. And the last note that I'll just say on some of these examples is that I did want to provide the broader context around Indigenous knowledge and the federal government. It is critical for us to acknowledge that for generations, federal policies systematically sought to assimilate and displace Indigenous people and eradicate Indigenous cultures. Indigenous knowledge has previously been misunderstood, misused, and ignored. We cannot erase that history. We can illustrate the kinds of mutually beneficial collaborations that are possible. And these were some examples of that. And our hope is to also provide guidance and best practices for federal agencies on how to do better. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to Haley to tell you more about this effort initiating from the White House.
Thank you, Gretchen. Just really quickly, as a quick introduction, my name is Haley K. Scott, and I'm a policy assistant at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in their Climate and Environment team, so I work with Gretchen. I'm also a member of the Confederated Tribes, the Siletz Indians, and a descendant of the Klamath tribes, Yurok tribes, and Sokogan Manitoba. I'm originally from Oregon, and so I'm happy to be participating in an Oregon-centered conference, and I'm so grateful that Laura invited us. And so just wanted to start off with that, thanks. And so going into the OSTP CEQ memorandum, a little bit more detail. So this effort, it's being led jointly by the White House OSTP and the Council for Environmental Quality, or CEQ. And so the memo, it includes a commitment and process to elevate Indigenous knowledge and federal decision making. And it also calls for White House guidance for federal agencies to be released around November 2022. And so the process so far, it's involved tribal consultation sessions and a public listening session and other expert engagement opportunities such as this session to ensure that Indigenous knowledge holders, scholars, and other relevant stakeholders can meaningfully shape the process and outcome of the guidelines. Next slide, please. So the guidance development process, it includes an interagency working group with more than 25 federal agencies and departments represented. So what you see on the screen here, it isn't everybody who's on the list, but we just wanted to show you the sense of breadth and depth of agency expertise involved in this effort. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in addition to the many federal career employees working towards the federal guidance, we have a great, awesome White House team at the Office of Science and Technology Policy and CEQ leading this effort. And so it includes myself and Gretchen, as well as several other colleagues with relevant experience and perspectives. Thank you. And so the guidance development process, it includes focus areas on definitions, collaboration, data sovereignty, relationship with Western science and federal policies and processes. And the content, it's going to be shaped, and you can click the next button. So thank you. So the content is going to be shaped by tribal consultations and input, but may also include elements such as best practices on how to collaborate with tribal nations and Native communities around ITEK application to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes, and then how to address federal government-wide challenges around ITEK, such as navigating federal laws and interagency processes, and then how to appropriately respect knowledge holders' rights to decline participation in these efforts to collaborate. Next slide, please. And so just as a recap, for the last month, we've been conducting our initial engagement period with tribal nations and Native communities, knowledge holders, scholars, and others with interest and expertise on Indigenous knowledge and federal decision making. So like I mentioned earlier, we held 2 tribal consultation sessions, a public listening session, as well as a few roundtable events in Hawaii that focused on engaging Hawaii and Pacific Island communities specifically. And more information on these engagement events, or I think we might be able to post a recap. I'm not sure if we have, Gretchen, but any information that we will be sharing is going to be on the whitehouse.gov or OSTP website if you want to check in about more information on that. And so we're still interested in hearing from you all today in this session or in writing afterwards. And so we've included our our email that we're gathering comments in, and then you can also see there's a link there to the past news sources on this. And so next slide, please. And so these are just some questions that we've been using to help guide input, and then just to really get the conversation started. And so we've been sharing these questions in every session we've been presenting in. We just had a listening session like this in Oklahoma last week for Air Quality Tribal Forum. And so these questions seem to help get that conversation going. And so we've just been including them in these sessions. And so I'll just read them really quickly. What would you like federal employees to know about Indigenous knowledge? How would you like to work with federal departments and agencies? What terminology should be used? So we kind of mentioned that already. Are there existing guidance documents, agreements, or practices that we should be paying attention to? And finally, how do you recommend ITEK be represented in the development of processes and content such as the National Climate Assessment? And I believe that's our last slide. And I think we can open it up now. So I will pass it back to you, Laura, to help with moderation.
Okay, thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, Haley. Okay, so this is the public listening session portion of this event. And if you have feedback that you would like to deliver to answer some of those questions, Haley, do you want to put those questions back up on the screen? Maybe we can do that. Or Gretchen, just so people can have those as a guiding thing. If you have any feedback or if you would like to talk directly, all you have to do is use the raise hand function on your Zoom, and then you'll be able to unmute. You can also put your comments in the Q&A box if you would like us to record those. So just raise your hand if you have anything that you'd like to say. When you do raise your hand, it'll take me a second to find you in the chat and then allow you to talk. So feel free to type out your questions or comments, and or you can put them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand.
So Laura, a quick note, Gretchen and I can't see the chat, and so we'd appreciate it if you could call it
I
out
can
for
read
us.
it.
Yeah.
I'll read it if people put it in there.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I can just clarify, I'm sorry, you can see, I think the little black boxes on my screen. This is a White House Zoom glitch, so apologies for that. But it helps me at least be able to see whoever's speaking.
Okay, so we do have Joseph Gazing Wolf. I'm going to unmute you, or I'm going to ask you to unmute. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, Dr. Goldman and Haley, good to be with you again. I know you've been doing these listening sessions for quite a few times, and thank you for taking the time to do that. So there's a couple of things that I would like to add to some of my previous comments that I've had with you in the past, and these are kind of geared towards where we're moving as a country, both federally and across states. So, I'm concerned that a lot of the conversation that we're having around this, it's really exciting and it's great that we're moving in this direction. But I wonder what's going to happen in November, right? I wonder what's going to happen in 2024 when there might be a change in administration. So I'm wondering if we're taking the long-term view about this in terms of how do we preserve TEK within federal policy, and how to preserve that line of communication across administrations, right? So there's a lot of wonderful energy in the Biden and Harris administration now, and with wonderful leadership like you all's, but what's going to happen in November and in 2024, right? So thinking about how do we institutionalize, how do we fully enfranchise TEK within federal policy making? One idea might be to have an office of tribal consultation, or a council to the president of some kind that is there permanently, that's institutionalized within federal circles. So at Arizona State University, for example, our president, Dr. Crow, he has that. He has a council of Indigenous scholars that he goes to that inform his decision making, right? Anytime he makes a decision, he wants to make sure that it how is it going to impact the tribal communities within Arizona? So that might be a good way to move forward in terms of institutionalizing this, making sure that this is something for the long term. And then another idea would be how do we open the lines of communication between tribal leaders and tribal nations, all 570 plus of them, with the federal government, right? How do we open those lines of communications? That could be via that office that exists or via that council that exists, but it could also be via regular listening sessions such as this, where tribal leaders are invited to speak directly to the administration and kind of voice some of their specific concerns. And then the office in Washington would then respond accordingly based on those concerns. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to kind of bring to your attention, specifically for my community, the Lakota, one of the things that we've been working towards is kind of recovering some of our important ceremonial sites. The primary one being the Black Hills, and so gaining access to that in terms of being able to perform our sacred ceremonies and traditions is quite important. And so thinking about how do we incorporate TEK in the broader sense, thinking about national monuments and national parks, things like that. I think it would be a good idea to also have, once again, institutionalized TEK within federal circles in the national parks. So you would have an office dedicated, once again, to local tribal communities, where representatives from those communities could be there, present, and inform policy and management at those national parks, right? So the Black Hills, you might imagine having an office, within the different monuments and parks that are there, that's responsible for doing public education, informing people about why the Black Hills are important and how they're important to the Lakota people, et cetera. So those are just a couple of ideas of kind of taking a long-term view to this, instead of it being just like, oh, we're really excited about this now, and then it all goes away in November. But again, thank you for your time, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I forget if you've already heard me respond to this in one of these other sessions, but I really appreciate your comments, and I just wanted to flag that's also something we're really actively thinking about, is that institutionalization, and how do we ensure that this is not something that just stops with this administration, because we really want to make sure this continues, and then it gets fully integrated across the government, and not just as a White House thing. And so I really appreciate those ideas and examples, and I think anything too we're thinking about is also how do we get it down into agencies and different processes, different decision points that are happening. So you had a few good ideas there too, and I think for everyone else, if there's other sort of places in the federal government where you see this come up, where it could be improved, we're also looking at some of that, and where is that institutionalization going to be needed. So thank you for your comments.
So I know that we've been having some people in the chat say that they cannot access the link that I've pasted there because the copy functions of, I guess, the Zoom webinar aren't working. Can someone put up the link to the PDF that was in the slides, the whitehouse.gov link? There we go.
Hold on, I think it's the other one though. The memo, they want the memo. That's the.
Yeah, I think it's
which
that one.
That's probably the one. That's the original commitment and process.
Yeah. And I'm sorry that it's not working on Zoom. I don't know why that's disabled. I did enable the chat now, so if you need to put anything in the chat, you're more than welcome to. We do have a comment from Janessa Stemke, who says, would a counsel to the president be heard by a president who doesn't want to listen to Indigenous concerns? Seems they were able to disband a bunch of things last term. What about something through the BIA? So I think that's a comment. Oh, I think someone just put in a link to the actual PDF in the questions as well. So Jenna said that was, I think that was more of a rhetorical question, unless Gretchen or Haley, you have any comments on that one? Would a counsel to the president be heard by a president who doesn't want to listen to Indigenous concerns? Seems they were able to disband a bunch of things last term. What about something through the BIA?
Yeah, I mean, I could just say that's sort of kinds of things we're thinking about in terms of institutionalization and how do you put processes in place, policies, culture, changing things so that even if there is a different direction from above or different priorities set later, that a lot of this work can continue. So I think yeah, having the BIA involved is a really good important step. Also, you saw Haley post the list of more than 25 agencies involved in this. I think we really want all those agencies to be involved in thinking about this and thinking about what does implementation look like at their agencies, because we know this will look really different, right? At the National Park Service, and the kinds of things that they could implement are going to be really different than what the CDC could do, or another part of the government. And so and there's all kinds of different processes and activities happening. And so I think that one crucial part that we'll be thinking about to address that kind of circumstance, if it were to happen, were to make sure that ad agencies were really thinking about implementation in different places. And so, the more places that we can get this, I think that helps with longevity as well.
There's another person who has put something in the question and answer section of the Zoom, and it's from Stalia Farrow. And they say, perhaps we've already discussed this, but how is the US federal government planning on handling the increased workload coming about as a result of various EOs or executive orders, memorandums, and acts of Congress, such as GAOA, the infrastructure bill, etc.? Are we looking at increasing capacity in tribal relations positions with within the federal government, increasing funding to tribes so they can increase staffing / capacity, or some other option?
It's a really good question. Also, Haley, feel free to interrupt me. I can't see your photo, so I can't tell if you're also interested in talking. So feel free to interrupt me whenever you have thoughts. But on that, I would say we definitely hear you on the resource constraints, and we're trying to think about how to minimize that, because there is a lot going on. And I think one good example is, I think with that the presidential memo on consultation, there was all of a sudden a ton of consultation requests. And so, for some people, I think they were just inundated with requests for consultation. And so I think we do need to think about some of those things and how can we streamline this. And actually, that is why you might have read these questions and been like, where did the national climate assessment come from? But that's part of actually that reason. We thought this is another project that comes out of our office. It's very important. It is relevant to this effort, and it will have a section on Indigenous communities, and that will include Indigenous knowledge. So we thought, let's streamline it and make one consultation and engagement period that includes that, so that we're not increasing demands separately for that. And so that was one place where we were trying to listen and try to do that streamlining. I think there is definitely a lot of opportunity for there to be more tribal relations specialists and others who are in the federal government and know this work. And so that is something else that we're also thinking about is, how do we either through capacity and trainings or other kinds of work can we make sure that we have people on the federal side that are trained and competent and knowledgeable about Indigenous knowledge and have that context going forward, because that's a really key element as well. So thank you for that.
Okay, so we have another person who has put something in the question and answer box. And folks, if you would like to unmute, all you have to do is use the raise hand function, and then I can unmute you and you can provide any comments or questions that you have. Our next one in the Q&A box, though, is from Chrisette Urbanhood. And it says, considering the history, shouldn't land back be a prerequisite for any further requests to partner and collaborate?
I think that's something you can absolutely provide input on. We're thinking about all kinds of land management questions and thinking about that actively. So I think that's definitely something that you can send to the mailbox and think about providing input on, and we can look at it.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. Thanks for that comment. I think one thing that we are hoping to hear from in these sessions, and we have heard quite a bit, is just best practices and then not best practices in terms of consultation or talking about land management or talking about stewardship. So what are good relationships that exist and what are some things that maybe shouldn't be copied? And so, yeah, I just wanted to put that in there as well. Thank you.
We do have a comment from Dave Johnson in the chat who says, interestingly, on the slide showing agencies involved, under DOI, the BLM was not listed. The memo is great, but I can tell you that without specific guidance from the national level, our regional managers are not going to get much done in this realm. And Dave Johnson, it says he's a tribal liaison / NAGPRA coordinator for the BLM in Oregon and Washington.
Thank you for that. I would love to learn more about that. If there's specific BLM issues or processes where this comes up or where you think guidance would be useful, that's a really excellent flag. So thank you for that.
Dave,
and I guess either if he wants to respond now or in the written is fine.
Dave, if you use the raise hand function, and if you want to chat more about this, I can unmute you, or I can allow you to speak so that you can provide more details if you'd like to, or you can just type those in the chat if you feel comfortable. And other folks, if you have other comments, please use the raise hand function or just put it in the Q&A section. We have an anonymous comment that says, as wildfires increase, will they consider an ITEK department to, at the very least, provide guidance to Forest Service and land management?
That's a great issue to raise. I think that's such a great example of where there could be really good coordination, and there is some coordination efforts, I know, both at the federal and state levels around the wildfire management and Indigenous practices around that. So I think, yeah, that's absolutely something we're interested in. And I think if there was, it sounds, I think I'm interpreting it as they're suggesting an office, like a federal office on TEK that would be within Forest Service, which is a good idea. I like that kind of thinking about, where in the process could this be implemented. So yeah, if there's other details or if I'm misunderstanding that, let me know, but I appreciate that.
So Dave added some more comments to the chat, and he says, as a good example, the executive order on old growth was a major topic of our BLM Oregon / Washington state leadership team, and no consensus reached on what we can do with that. This could be a prime opportunity to involve tribes / ITEK, but without direction, this is a tough sell for me to our managers who are willing but hesitant to set precedents.
Okay, that's hugely helpful
Yeah.
for understanding.
Rosalie Jimenez, and if I pronounce anyone's names incorrectly, I apologize, says we need to expand legislation on cultural burning. Cultural practitioners are required to get red cards and follow other fire requirements, but they are experts in cultural burning. What are we doing to provide waivers or have other requirements outlined for cultural practitioners?
So I can't speak to specific waivers or if there are legislation. I can just name some examples though that we've been taking into consideration, and then just what I know from past experience. There is one, I guess, one example or one template that could be built upon potentially in consideration of these guidelines. And so thinking about memorandums of understandings between, we'll say, like a national park or a national forest and a tribe or an indigenous community. So one example that comes to mind, I think in Oregon and Northern California, just because that's where I'm from, so I got to speak to it, is the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. And so I believe that is a partnership between a national forest in that area and a few different tribes in the region as well. And so that's one best practice, or maybe one relationship that we can think about when we're talking about best practices, collaboration building and knowledge sharing. And so, it's something to think about. But yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question.
So Monique says yes to the cultural burning question. There is a precedent that is being set by the state of California that other states can follow. Sorry, this is not a question, and that's okay. Comments are good too, Monique. We also have another follow-up from Dave, and he says, I've got a high-level manager working in the space next to me, so can't get into a discussion as there are ongoing meetings that he'd be talking over. But thank you, Dave, for typing out your feedback. We appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'd say we'd also take any, if you want to email us after, Dave, if there's something, if it's things you don't want to say out loud, we're happy to chat more.
Can you remind us again of what email that comments can be sent to, Gretchen?
Yeah, I'll put it up on that slide again.
And Joseph, I see your hands up, so I will unmute you momentarily.
Yeah, so this is the email, and so Haley and I have access to that mailbox, so we can respond.
Okay, so this is Joseph again.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts. The discussion about fire kind of brought these to my mind, and with some of the concerns that were raised by comments. So one of the ways I see this happening again over the long term is where we have tribal people that work for federal agencies, right? So I'm thinking of one of my mentors with regards to fire, Dr. Frank Lake, who works for the Forest Service and has done a tremendous amount of work to revitalize traditional fire with the Yurok in California, his home tribe, and as well as in a lot of other places. So one idea would be to kind of enfranchise this. One idea would be to have that preference that is made for military within federal agencies, right? So when I come to apply to a position with the Forest Service, if I am ex-military or active military, I'm given a preference. My application goes to the top of the pile. One idea would be to do the same thing for tribal members, right? If we want to enfranchise TEK, and we have people who have expertise, who are traditional fire makers, et cetera, one thing would be to kind of move their application up to the top of the pile as well. Again, if we want that relationality to take place over the long term.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And that, yeah, that is definitely a challenge we are thinking about, is the challenges around hiring and how do we get the expertise that you really need for this work, and ensuring people have an opportunity. So I really appreciate that idea.
Okay, we have some more comments in the chat. This is from Don Motinik. He says, I'd recommend the ITEK office for wildland fire to be located in the Office of Wildland Fire, so it involves all agencies. And then Dave Johnson says traditional burning of public lands has been an issue. I've tried to get going on both California and Oregon. I think this is supposed to be a slash Washington BLM lands for years, but the liability issue is huge, particularly given the current situation in New Mexico. Do you have any comments on those comments, Gretchen or Haley, before I read another comment?
Yeah, I would just say I appreciate that challenge, and I think that is one of the reasons. Oh, sorry, sorry, Haley, you know more about this, please.
No, I was your comments, so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, I think, yeah, that's maybe one reason, one challenge presented by that. So I was just going to say, if there's state level practices that people like or they think addresses this challenge in a way that is a good example, that's definitely something we're interested in, because I think, yeah, I noted that that's a challenge.
Okay, thank you. So for folks who want to talk, you can use the raise hand function and I can unmute you. You can also put your comments in the chat like other folks are doing right now. Heather Gordon says, I just wanted to share a recent journal article I published called Alaska Native Subsistence Rights, Taking an Anti-Racist Decolonizing Approach to Land Management and Ownership for Our Children and Generations to Come. She provides the access link as well and says, I also discussed it on a radio program yesterday, which is accessible here. She provides a link for that and says the article emphasizes the importance of Indigenous knowledge in management decisions for food security and substance rights. Heather, if you want to chat more about your paper or anything, feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you. Oh, okay. Here we go.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'll just talk very briefly. The article really emphasizes the importance of Indigenous knowledge being included in land and water management and how difficult it is to access our subsistence foods, which is so much more than food security for us. It's our spirituality, it's our culture, it's what we want to pass on to our children. And the way things are being managed, these populations are going extinct, and this is just really not sustainable, obviously. And research has actually shown that lands that are stewarded by Indigenous people instead of being managed through Western science actually have more ecologic diversity and better population counts. So the article I put in there talks specifically about Alaska and the difficulties of land management, where the state of Alaska really emphasizes economic benefit from the land, which is a very common thing that Indigenous people face, where a Western approach to land management is what can they get from it? What money can they get from it? What resource extraction can they get from it? Where our approach is a form of stewardship and relationality with the land and understanding that animals give themselves to us to be provided for. And that's why we in return have this relationship and caring for the land. So I really want to emphasize that there are federal structures, there are state structures, and both of these cause issues in Indigenous people managing their own land, specifically in Alaska, because land is not reservation land except for Metlakatla, so there is no right of the tribes to manage the land. However, I'm not at all saying that it's so much better in the lower 48, since the amount of land Indigenous people are on for their reservations are greatly reduced. So I would like to echo one of the first speakers, and this is also something I discuss in the article, that land back is true decolonization and is really the first and most necessary required step in order to include Indigenous knowledge in stewardship practices as well. And in Alaska specifically, I would emphasize that the current federal legislature has the ability to give Alaska Native people's subsistence priority in the state of Alaska, which they currently do not have. It's a rural subsistence priority in Alaska, which means that so many Native people who may have moved to the city for monetary reasons and the lack of jobs in rural areas, if they want to go to rural areas to practice their subsistence, they're not always allowed to do that. So, I encourage thinking of looking at Alaska a little bit, as we have a little bit of a different situation there, and looking at applying the Indian General Commerce Clause to allow for Alaska Native subsistence as a priority population. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. I appreciate your continued engagement on this, and I always appreciate your perspectives. That's a really great flag. Thank you for the article and the context around Alaska challenges and the challenges in general around things not being on tribal land and the management and subsistence challenges around that. We're definitely thinking about that. I'd just also just generally say around the federal state intersection, that's also something we're interested in hearing about. So if there's other sort of state federal discrepancies or challenges or ways we could address any of those, that's also of interest.
Okay, so we have a couple comments in the chat and then another question and answer. And Anne, I see that your hand is up too, so I will get to that after I read these comments. From Rosalie Jimenez, she says, for the Forest Service, buy-in from forest supervisors from cultural burning is needed. Maybe more so for education, so they can learn about cultural burning and the benefits. So that's one comment. We have a question that was put in the Q&A box from Amanda O'Connell, who's a councilwoman for the Tolowadeni Nation down in California. And she says, I would like to see the ITEK work with federal departments be reciprocal. Yes, tribes have much ITEK to contribute. However, data sets that the federal departments have should also be shared with tribes. This reciprocity makes the process mutually beneficial between sovereigns. One of the challenges I see is ITEK is ever evolving, and often with federal departments, tribal input gets documented and becomes stagnant in the sense that the departments feel the quote tribal input consultation quote box is checked, when in reality ITEK is sometimes fluid depending on the current circumstances of the environment.
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments, Councilwoman. That is absolutely something we're thinking about, is how to both ensure that it is Indigenous knowledge is given the appropriate platform in federal decision making, and also ensuring it is mutually beneficial and it is protected in a lot of ways. And there's, as you likely know, there's a lot of federal challenges in how to think about that in terms of disclosure laws and requirements for what needs to be recorded in public when. And so we're definitely thinking about a lot of those data sovereignty challenges. So yeah, I would just add, if there's any good models or agreements or any place, a process or an example of where you've seen that done well, we'd be interested, because that is an active discussion point.
If you are just joining us, this is a White House public listening session about the Biden administration's Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge initiatives. Feel free to use the raise hand function on Zoom, and I can unmute you if you would like to give some comments about these initiatives or some thoughts on how traditional ecological knowledge is being considered by the federal government. And you can also put your questions and answers in the Q&A box or in the chat, and I'll read them. But if you want to unmute, just raise your hand. And I'm going to unmute you and Ross. So here we go.
Thank you. My comment is kind of crazy. I know this seems impossibly ambitious, but it seems to me that Native Americans are Okay, I've never articulated this before, but Native Americans are, represented by the government in some way, but yet there's no direct link between tribal governments, it seems, and the president and vice president. It seems like there needs to be some representation at a very high level, higher than the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or, but at the level that really represents and helps to inform at a national level, like another vice president, or even, I don't know what could work, but it seems like the tribes need to have some representation at a much higher level than all of these other things. These TEK questions about how to implement can be done at a different level, and they can be under an umbrella of a larger office or representative. That's all.
Yeah, I'll just say I appreciate big ideas. I think this is because of the prioritization of some of these issues in this administration. It does seem it's the time to think bigger, and what could different models look like. And so yeah, appreciate your thinking about that.
We have a comment from Chrisette Urbanhood, and they say, thank you for underscoring that TEK comes from a long-term relationship with land. So if we don't have land, there's no TEK. Land back has to come first, or it's just extractive, like it's always been. And then Callum Cintron says, how will free, prior, and informed consent be integrated into future decisions with the addition of the ITEK initiative?
Yeah, that's another area that we're thinking about, and making, I think you saw in one of Haley's slides that we're thinking about that, specifically the right to decline, and and we're very cognizant of making sure we're not doing anything that creates additional challenges or requirements, or situations where tribes and knowledge holders have to prove things that be validated by the federal government in a way. So we're trying to avoid anything that would create that situation. So that's definitely that we are definitely thinking about free, prior, informed consent, and how that can be integrated in different places and agencies, and where that's appropriate, because there's a lot of places where those concepts have come up, and we're trying to make sure we can be prescriptive in the guidance and in some of those details. I don't know if Haley wants to add anything, but that's a high level.
No, I don't think so. I think you got it.
Rosa says, how are we trying to incorporate non-federally recognized tribes in this process?
Yeah, so we're not, this is not specific to federally recognized tribes. So our engagement period has included both federally recognized tribes and other Indigenous people. And so we're trying to ensure that this is not exclusive to that. We did do tribal consultations with the federally recognized tribes and have had some meetings. And in addition, we've done a few public listening sessions, events like this. We did events in Hawaii, as Haley noted. And so I think in terms of thinking about TEK in the federal government, it doesn't need to be limited to that. And so there's lots of places that we're working to make sure it is not only that context, while recognizing the trust responsibility and some of the federal recognitions that federally recognized tribes have.
Rosa says, what about legislation?
Yeah, you are welcome to talk to Congress and tell them what you think.
She also says some agreements and contracts are only for federally recognized tribes.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk more about that on the mic or anything like that? Any of your comments on that? I can unmute you if you raise your hand. Sorry, Gretchen, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Okay, so we have Rosa. Okay, Rosa, you should be good to talk.
Hi. So just in the aspect of, I guess I should have expanded more on my question. I know that we're including them, I guess, in the communication aspect of this process, but I'm wondering how, you know, for legislation, the aspect of agreements and contracts as well, because most of them are only for federally recognized tribes. We have a couple that, or there's a handful that we could use to work with tribes, but we have to have a match requirement, and typically non-federally recognized tribes can't meet that match requirement, or it's more difficult. I know there's other avenues like grants and et cetera to help them meet that match, but it is definitely a huge barrier that our agency, the Forest Service, is going through. So I was just wondering if you could expand on maybe how we could make that easier, or if there's processes to make that easier, because that's a big aspect of going to implement TEK in our forest is we have to set up our agreements.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification on what you mean. Yeah, there's definitely some places where there's restrictions, and I think there's a lot of space for agencies to look at some of those decisions and think about how they can do it. I'm less familiar with those specific grants, so I don't know if there's sort of congressional mandates or other kind of restrictions on how you can use the money, but I know that there have been some agencies that have looked at their grant solicitations and worked to make sure that they can be inclusive of TEK in the grant, and make sure that the money that is allocated can be used for things like tribes collecting and traditional ecological knowledge. So I think there's some stuff we can do, agencies can do on the grant side to think about how to ensure that there's a more inclusive process. As far as whether or not the non-federally recognized tribes can be allocated the money, I think that's going to be very agency specific. So I appreciate that comment. I'm going to look into that. But if there's specific grants at the Forest Service where you think that's a specific challenge, I'd be interested in knowing which processes.
I know we're trying to get funding from the Native Acts Fund, but those directly have to go to federally recognized tribes. And we are trying to work on a project in their visitor center and provide them funding so they can accurately represent themselves in that visitor center. And we're actually having to jump through a lot of red tape just to pay them for their services. So that's
even for them to be involved in the
process.
Visitor center. Oh, okay.
Yeah, fun stuff, even to do simple things. That's why I was just asking if there was, ideas of making it simpler for us to work with our local tribes, because it can be a bit of a hassle for us. And I'm in the tribal relations department, so I'm definitely more dedicated into figuring these things out, whereas I bet other people are not.
Yes. Okay. I really appreciate that example. So yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that we're thinking about, because I think there's people like you who want to do this and are facing hurdles. And so we're trying to figure out that kind of examples of where are the hurdles? How do we reduce the barriers to doing it? And so I think if there's even barriers to involvement of people, which is that's definitely something that we should look at, because
it just makes it hard for us to be inclusive. I'm from a non-federally recognized tribe in California. It's a band of the Yokuts for the wood chimney. So I just understand how they feel in the aspect of recognition and trying to work with people. And so I just want to make sure that we're being inclusive, especially for the California tribes here.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'd love to follow up with you on that as well.
Okay, so our next question is from Maria Dunleavy, and they ask, having worked for both tribal government and now federal government, I would echo the earlier question about increased staffing capacity in order to work on these new initiatives. I think particularly on the tribal side. I worked for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians implementing a plant gathering program on Great Smoky Mountains National Park under 36 CFR 2.6. And it was a big administrative lift for our department without any additional funding or staff.
Yeah, definitely appreciate additional comments on the resource constraints, especially on the tribal side.
So if anyone else has questions or comments that they would like to deliver about ITEK and the memorandum of ITEK that we've talked about during this whole session, please use the raise hand function and I can unmute you. You can also put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. Yeah. I'm not seeing anything right now.
And I can reiterate, while we wait for anyone, just that we're also, we'll take any written feedback now, and for anything that, for anyone who doesn't want to talk in this venue, but has something to add, we're taking that there and happy to have further dialogue.
And also, if you use the Q&A function, you can submit your comments anonymously. If you don't want me to read your name, you can have an anonymous comment in there, and that's okay too. Gretchen, can you tell us a little bit about the process? This is just a question for me about how you are using this feedback to inform the policy and development, and like when do you think the end results of that, or what are the next steps that are going to happen? Just anything on the timeline in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And you're asking that made me realize we did sort of skip the Q&A kind of portion. So we also could just answer questions if that's of interest as well. But yeah, so the timeline is, the plan is that this guidance will be out by the end of 2022. So the idea was to have this initial step of, well, I guess the initial step was the memorandum that came out last November. And then this next step is guidance for federal agencies. And so we're hoping to have that out by the end of the year. And then that will provide the high level guidance for federal agencies around Indigenous knowledge. And then after that, there'll be an implementation phase where agencies are implementing the guidance. And before that is out, I'll say right now, we are collecting feedback, compiling, considering inputting it all into drafts, a draft of the guidance. And then the next few months will be us continuing to get that input, getting feedback on how we are thinking about that guidance, both internal and external feedback, inside and outside the government feedback, and then we'll work up a draft and it'll go through the review processes for the federal government to be released by the end of the year.
Thank you so much. Dr. Daniel Wildcat, who is one of our keynote speakers for the summit, has a question, and he's asking, can we get Gretchen's contact information? And I think the email address is on the screen right now if everyone can see that. But Gretchen, if you have any other contact information that you want to provide, feel free.
Yeah, Dr. Wildcat, it's thank you for coming. I'm glad you're here and happy to chat. So yeah, you can use that email address, and then I will respond to it. So then you can have mine, and same for anyone that wants to have it. We'd love to chat with you more about this as well.
Joseph, I saw you raised your hand. Do you want to talk again? And you're more than welcome to. Okay, I'm going to unmute you.
No, I was just going to comment on Dr. Wildcat's comment, because when Gretchen and Haley joined us in the TEK section with ESA, I had probably 100 requests for a direct email to Dr. Goldman, and I was like, guys, you know, she gave an email that you can contact her, I guess, through the White House email, but I don't have a direct contact for her. So that's a desire out there, Dr. Goldman, just in case you weren't aware of it.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. Well, just so you all know, I'm not trying to be elusive about my personal email. It's actually for the purpose of making sure that the comments can be seen by our whole team, because I want to make sure that everyone has access to the input, because if it's only via me, I don't want to be the sole way that it is getting considered. And so sending it to that email box, just I will still see it. It is just, and respond if it is just to ensure that anyone who is working on this guidance is able to see and consider the comment. So it's more just making sure that you can really get into the process. But noted. I'm also on Twitter if that's another contact opportunity for folks.
It looks like Anne is going to ask a question. Okay, Anne, feel free to unmute.
Thank you. Another big question is it possible to give public lands back to the tribes and then have it managed, the lands managed by the tribes? It seems like that would be a way to do the land back and have the land managed more sustainably.
Yeah, some of the answers to that will be above my level of at the White House, certainly, or in the government in general. But I will say on the point on management, co-management, and other opportunities for that, there is currently a bigger conversation and more efforts to do co-management practices on with the federal government and on land. And so I think that this is a really exciting time for advancing a lot of that. And you know, I talked about Papahana, Makuakea, but there's also some efforts around, and the Acadia National Park with the Wabanaki tribes example. And there's also newer efforts around that, and thinking about how to really expand where there's co-management and co-production of knowledge in different places. And some of those conversations are happening both within the federal government and outside of it. And so I think now is a time to think about, you know, where are there good places where that could be implemented more, because I think that is a really good opportunity. And as you said, it is a good, you know, it's a really great way to ensure that TEK is considered, and so and prioritized and used in decision making and all of that. So I think it's a really good point about that step and the land management issues.
I know that a lot of folks have kind of recently come in the room. So if you have any comments or questions or anything like that about ITEK or so we have some guiding questions that are on the screen right now. Like if you, what do you want federal employees to know about ITEK, or how would you like to work with federal departments and agencies in the future to ensure that ITEK properly informs federal processes and policies? Just look at the slide. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to use the raise hand function, put a question in the chat or the QA box. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you so you can actually speak. And it looks like we have, Anne says, thank you. And then Myra says, maybe just me, but I feel that there is not much focus on getting more traditional elders involved with this critical sensitive area. Scientists have their place as the elders live the knowledge. Question is, will we be seeing more elders? Thanks. Oh, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to read your name. I just saw that you put anonymous. There is a function, by the way, when you're chatting, that you can click a box that says send as anonymous, so I won't see your name. And I didn't mean to read your name. I'm sorry.
I really appreciate that. And that is a good point, that we hadn't mentioned that much in this conversation. I think, yeah, that is a really key element, and, you know, not something that we want to overlook. I think, Yeah, well, I guess I'd say I'm interested in input on where, how is it best to engage in those conversations? There's often a lot of, as we've been discussing, a lot of the engagement with the federal government is through tribal leaders, and so I think that is a question that I'm interested in, is sort of how best to make that connection, and what is the appropriate process for that, because that is both cognizant of relationships and internal to Indigenous communities protocols and culture, and thinking about it, because you're right that is where a lot of this knowledge is held, and so that's a key component. I think on that too, I'll just say there's a lot of other federal programs focused on different pieces. There's a native language focus effort going on now to ensure that language survives, which we know is very integrated with a lot of the TEK that we're talking about. And so I think there's other efforts to also advance this issue from other dimensions. I don't know if Haley, you wanted anything else to say on that, but I'm really glad you flagged that importance of elders being involved in this discussion.
Okay, so our next question is from Monique, and they ask, subsistence gathering is happening more and more off the reservation within the ancestral homelands of Indigenous communities by tribal and non-tribal people. I would like to see more dialogue on how to protect the responsible management and collection of cultural plants for community food sovereignty, while preventing the monetization, appropriation, and privatization of these resources by other non-tribal groups.
Yeah, I'll just say that is the kind of issue that we're thinking about, and sort of what is the because it is unique, right? The subsistence element is not the same as recreational activities that are happening outside of Native communities, and so I think that is a challenge, and we are thinking about how to address that in various ways.
Leah White has their hand up, so I'm going to unmute you, and you can chat.
Sorry, that was accidental.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. We do have a comment from Dawn in the chat, and Dawn is providing a link to a network of tribal storytellers, which is wisdomoftheelders.org. It's a good resource. So if you're looking for resources, that's a good one. And then we have an anonymous attendee who says, is there protections for TEK as tribes' intellectual property?
Yeah, we are thinking a lot about that, confidentiality and property, and how to think about it. So I think there's different, I think that addressing that is going to be different in different kinds of circumstances in terms of federal processes. So we're thinking about ways of providing guidance to agencies that provides some ideas about addressing that in different contexts. And so I think there'll be different kinds of there'll be different kinds of solutions in different contexts for around that, but I'm definitely interested if you have any ideas on ways of addressing that in different places, because as we discussed before, I think a lot of the challenges around federal requirements in certain processes, there's different sort of transparency, ownership requirements. And so how do you both elevate Indigenous knowledge and in processes that have some of those constraints? So if there's ways that you think that can be addressed, I'm very interested in that, because we're definitely thinking about that.
As kind of a follow-up question to this one, are you consulting the articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at all when you're thinking about tribal rights?
Yes.
Okay, another question from an anonymous attendee. Are there plans or thoughts that many tribes have ecological knowledge for lands that they do not currently occupy? For example, the Northern Arapaho tribe is located in Wyoming, but their elders may have a lot of knowledge about areas in Colorado, their traditional ancestral lands.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. And I'm definitely interested if people have thoughts on places where this comes up for displaced communities. I think, there's obviously lots of regions where that is true. And I think, yeah, I don't want to dismiss that. So I'm interested in hearing more about that. If people, if there's specific places where that comes up, or areas where you think that could be recognized more, because that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Can I just add really quickly? I think it would be great to get stories from folks whose families have been removed from their traditional homelands, because I know that's generally the case across the United States. So just thinking about a specific example, like my band of people were moved from the southern Oregon coast to the northern Oregon coast. And of course, like the whole Oregon coast is cold and horrible, but there's different knowledge systems that they brought with them. And so how did their place-based knowledge, how does it influence where they're at now? Or how are they creating new knowledge that they're hoping to pass down? And so I'd just say that that's something that we're looking for as well.
As someone who's on the Oregon coast right now, Haley, your comment made me laugh about how cold it is out here. So we have another anonymous question that says, how will the federal government assist with repairing the damage the U.S. military has done to Hawaii's water supply that has been devastating to the community there?
Yeah, I appreciate that example. And I think that is, thinking about the Department of Defense, I think there's a lot of issues and different kinds of complexities that come up. So that's a really good example, and I appreciate your raising it.
Another question is, what is the U.S. timeline for implementing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples so the U.S. can begin to support peace processes and access to justice for Indigenous peoples using traditional ecological knowledge to mitigate the damage the U.S. does to our ecosystems?
I would love to have that comment in writing. That is something that will intersect with this process, this effort around TEK guidance, but it also is much broader, as you note. So I think the more places that is voiced, that will be helpful.
A follow-up question is, are there plans to help reestablish those land relationships when addressing TEK?
I guess I want clarity on reestablishing relationships between tribes and the land, or between the federal government and the land.
Whoever wrote that comment, if you can provide some clarity, or if you want to raise your hand in chat, please do. The next question is, will the Biden administration reverse the process advanced by the previous administration to adhere to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? And what are examples of this progress so far?
I would appreciate additional information on that. It sounds like they're suggesting the previous administration had made progress around UNDRIP.
Reverse. So will the Biden administration reverse the process advanced by the previous administration? Oh, yeah, I guess
process.
that's, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I would love more details on that, or if either the person or anyone else knows what the new development was.
We do have, I know we have questions that are kind of flying in the chat. I'm going to unmute you, Thomas, because you have your hand up, and then I'll go back to the chat. There you go.
Yeah, the question that I had asked was that the Trump administration actually did some active movements to withdraw from a lot of the agreements that were made with the United Nations. And so within that is included the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights. And so what I was asking, since you're a representative of the Biden administration, is can you give us some examples of how the Biden administration has walked back on that progress that was made by the Trump administration to remove the United States from any agreements with the United Nations?
Oh, okay, got it. I appreciate that clarification. That is separate from this issue, and so I'm not really able to speak to where the administration is overall, since that's a international context situation, and I'm just not involved in those conversations. But I appreciate you're making the connection that in terms of the UN relationships and agreements that have happened, that the UNDRIP one is within that, and so that's a good point.
Thank you, Thomas. Okay, so we have a few more questions, and we have probably about 5 or 6 more minutes left. So I think the person who is the anonymous attendee has asked multiple questions here. So I'm gonna skip down a little bit. And Tully Ilkovich asks, given the legacy of the federal government's treatment of tribes, particularly in context of the ongoing nature of colonization, what is involved in the process for building trust and reconciliation?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. I think there is a long history here, and we are not doing this in a vacuum. This is in the context and with that history and with those past experiences and trauma involved in the conversation. And so I would love input on, what does that look like to you? What should be involved in that, and how are ways that we can help start to address that in this context of this process, or more broadly for the administration, because I think that's a really key point.
Gretchen, do you want to put up your email address again, just in case? So if you have other questions and comments after we end this session, you can send your comments to their email address. There it is, where it says written comments on the slide. Dr. Jessica Hernandez, who was our keynote speaker yesterday, asks, or she says, I was wondering, in regards to traditional ecological knowledge and displacement, who is the best department to advocate to or education in regards of Indigenous peoples being displaced externally due to climate change? UNDRIP is not applied to Indigenous climate refugees, unfortunately, in the immigration policies around this administration.
I would love to have a longer conversation with you about that, Dr. Hernandez. I think that's a really excellent point. And so Haley and I are in the Climate and Environment Division of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And so we are thinking about a lot of other those dimensions on climate-induced migration and challenges. So I think that's a really good point about that, and that's also one of the reasons I was sort of interested in thinking about displaced peoples, where that comes up. So where are the federal processes where that could be, we could give that more attention, because I think I'm interested in hearing about that, because I think these are really key elements to raise.
We have a comment from Desiree Kissel, and she says, I just want to echo Anne's comment regarding public lands becoming available. This topic came up in a conversation yesterday. How can tribal nations influence policy to ensure that public lands that come available are offered first to a tribal nation to prevent it from being turned into housing developments, which recently happened in Western North Carolina?
Yeah, that's a good example and a good point about the broader challenge of public land availability and what happens with it.
We have a question that says, will the Biden and Harris administration oh, no, I already read that one. Sorry. So this was Thomas's question. I didn't X that one out, but he's extending on to that Biden administration question about if the UN declaration provides the ground to recognize Indigenous peoples who are displaced and follow a consultation or if so, the UN Declaration provides the ground to recognize Indigenous peoples who are displaced and follow a consultation with those peoples in diaspora.
Okay, appreciate that flag.
Okay, folks, I think we are at the end of the session today. Gretchen or Haley, do you have any other comments before we transition to our next session?
I just want to thank all of you for this engagement. This was hugely valuable for our process, and I just appreciate all of you taking the time and labor to share with us. And we're absolutely taking written comment as has been flagged. So if there's other things that occur to you, or examples or links, or places that or anything else you want to share, we're very interested. And just want to thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much to Laura for hosting, and we look forward to the rest of the conference as well. Haley, do you have other final words?
Nope, following up on Gretchen's thanks. Thanks everybody for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for your time and for opening up this possibility for conference attendees to chat with you about their thoughts and comments and questions. So, and thanks to everyone else who provided their feedback as well. We appreciate it. And we have about 4 minutes before the next session starts. So feel free to take a break, get some water, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, folks.